Okay, so let's continue on. Um, After our conceptual conversation of MVC, N-tier, separation of concerns, and some of the history and evolution of MVC, let's get into Express. Let's see what Express does with it. Let's start with a simple example. If you remember from your older notes, you had an example in HTTP to do your simple Hello World application. It's shown here in purple on the bottom, right? You had to get the HTTP module, create a server, write out your response status and headers and your content type in particular, indicate a listen on a port number and indicate what your response was, and we use the end to do that to indicate part we were writing out. Express, well, hello world, it's hard to get shorter than that, but let's just even look in structurally how it's a bit different. First, we've got to require Express. In fact, you got to go install Express first. Express is not built into Node by default because again, you have your choice of what MVC framework to use. So you have to go get Express via npm install of Express. You just do that once. And then you have to include Express by having your require statement, and you bind it to a symbol. In this case, traditionally, you just call it Express. You execute the constructor on it, and traditionally, you will get back a symbol. People by convention tend to use app to represent the application. Notice here a call to listen. In this case, we're not passing in the function, the callback, and a create server call. That went away. Instead, we were specifically telling the application to listen on a particular port. And now we indicate what verb, so this part here is the HTTP verb, and what URL, relative URL, that we want to bind to, if you will. And based on whatever is going to get a HTTP get on the /URL is going to execute this callback function. All right, we still bind to a request response. So look, this is very similar, although I don't have to write the headers either. I have default headers. Express will use convention over configuration, meaning it will assume that it's successfully able to construct the response and do some intelligent things for you, like set the content type, like write the 200 OK header out for you, assuming everything is OK. Also notice that it's using a different response verb. It's using send as opposed to the data and end parts, or the writer and end parts, I should say, that we use back in the global HTTP. So this is an example of that convenience function wrapping, if you will. So, you know, is this really all that earth-shattering? Well, I'm already running it for you. I just did my npm install of Express, in fact, on this computer I present to you on. Oops, that's the wrong window. Let me go to my browser window. Let me open up a tab, and I'll go to http localhost : I think I'm running this on 8081, I think. And there it says hello from Express. So same functional output, but done by a different structure and different organizing principle. All right. Let's do something maybe a little bit more interesting. So that part of indicating the verb and the URL, okay, that part is called routing. All right. Let's go back to our step 3. Right. We said we need to route or delegate to something. We are routing or binding that route, that relative URL, and the verb, and indicating from that point that we're going to execute some callback function on it. So this is similar to our hello world, except for in this case we're going to assume success on this particular. In fact, this might actually look better. This is your Express send example here. It's going to run on port 8082. This is in brackets, and so we're writing out raw HTML again. We're still writing out our hello from Express. I can still set things on my response explicitly if I want to make sure it's 200 for whatever reason. And I only say that because you can change defaults in Express via settings file. There's actually a settings example in the code I pushed to GitHub. So usually you don't need to do this, but this gives you an example of where you can do all this stuff just like you look like you could do it in HTTP. You can set all your headers that you want to send explicitly with your content of your response. So there's our step 4, there's our step 5, right? When we talk about our steps, here's step 4, and here's step 5 of our template pattern, right? And then we're going to write it out, and there's 6, right? There's 4, 5, and 6. from dealing with our response. And it does some logging out to the screen as well. Now also look at this one. Well, so what happened if we put an error? What happened if we didn't give the right URL? What happened if we wanted to redirect to an error file in case we couldn't do something? Well, this one binds to /error, so you can have a global error handling. Notice that this is a 400 level, which indicates a bad client request, so we're doing something different with the response under that. So we can run that example. Let me change that. Let's run NodeExpress send. All right, let's go up to, I guess this one was on 8082. We're going to do /. We still got our hello from Express. It was an H1, so it's a little formatted. Now I can put in error. What do I get? Oh, I get this is a bad request. And in fact, if I looked and sniffed my traffic, I would see in the response header that I had a response header status set that's different. So I can look at that again. All right, and when I look at the response, request and response headers on here, 400 bad request. Right? That's the status request that came back from HTTP. What happens if we put in something else, right? I don't have / and I don't have /error, so what's going to come out here? Cannot get. So again, now I just inputted a URL for which I do not have a binding for, and I don't have what's called a route for in Express. So Express gives me a default message, again, configurable in your settings and so forth. But it basically says that by default, you're sending me a GET, right? Because I typed into the address bar. This is the default 404 message, right? Because I got the not found on here. Because I don't know what's that supposed to be at /l, so it didn't map to anything. Okay, so that's how Express works. That's simple routing logic, right? Verb and route relative URI. Okay, so those are your different routes. This is an example. Again, another kind of piece of conceptual background or history for you. In server-side web development, historically, there's been kind of two ways of dealing with user interaction, and the longest running way, the older way I should say, is what's called action-oriented, or sometimes called page-oriented approach to developing these frameworks, which means we deal with a particular user action that's coming in and look to render a response with respect to that action. In fact, that historically kind of maps back to, if you remember the diagram in the other notes, where we talked about the browser down here doing this entire page turning, request, and response does, the response is the entire page that came back to the browser and so forth. So you had this kind of back and forth approach to programming. Now this action-oriented or page-oriented is, it reduces, so that when we talk about action versus on the slide component frameworks for the web, action had the benefit of reducing impedance mismatch. You've heard me say this term before, and I said it exists in several flavors on the web. The impedance mismatch that this reduces is the synchronous nature of HTTP, right? The request and the response part. You give a request, you wait, you get the entire response back. You give a request, you get the entire response back. The problem is, and I'll switch back to the notes in a minute, but while I'm talking here, I might as well explain the difference between action and component-oriented. In a component-oriented world, you would look at think of your browser page. Maybe you had some left nav here, meaning some menu options to navigate. Maybe you got some top nav here, right? That you see common on websites. You have some content displayed on the page, and you may even have an interactive widget, right? Maybe you post comments here or share social media here, and this is text, and this is a picture. I'll draw my smiley face there. In a component-oriented world, we think of the user interface as comprised of different widgets, different components, each with their own interaction model. And this is very familiar to us if you've done desktop user interface programming, right? So this would be some kind of text display component. This would be some kind of image that maybe you can manipulate, zoom in, whatnot. You might have a little text area here to enter things, and this one might be your share buttons or something, right? That you do to social media, share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook, share it on Reddit, whatever you're doing. But that kind of interaction modeling viewed each widget as responding to events. Okay. Now, pre-Ajax, front-end programming on the web, what really happened is if I say interacted here and I wanted to post a comment, I would have to do that via an HTML form with a submit button up to the server, and then the server would have to respond back and draw this entire page all over again, even though maybe all that it wanted to do was just change what went in that comment field. All right, it still did an entire page turn like this model. Okay, now there were some technologies in server-driven programming. For example, one was called, in the Java world, was called Java Server Faces, that tried to address this by providing the desktop UI type programming model, which is event oriented, meaning I click on a button, I enter text in a text field, that kind of thing, and try and bring it to the web without having to refresh an entire page, or at least not without the programmer having to think of this desktop UI model in the context of this, what's called a page turning model. All right. So there are server-side frameworks for that. Now, we're going to revisit this exact concept. I'll hang on to these scribbles when we talk about the concept of Ajax and how that has impacted this whole model. All right. But I speak to you about that because when you think of programming a user interface on a desktop versus the web, they don't feel the same, because underlying the page are these form actions that require an HTTP request around to the server to get the information you need to redraw the entire page, which is different than thinking of just manipulating an individual component in the context of a desktop user interface. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about in the top half of this slide. All right, we don't really need these component-oriented frameworks. We're going to have rich GUI libraries based on Ajax and things like that, but we still need to know how to dispatch actions, things the user does, to the proper delegation logic, the proper what's called endpoint on the server. In other words, we need to route, we need to delegate, we need a controller. Okay, in Express, as well, and we'll see this in Angular when we get to it on the front end, that this delegation is called a route, right? And the general form of routing in Express, as I said, is app.invoke the verb, naming the method, with a path, the potential to invoke what's called some middleware. Middleware will be our next discussion, not this one. So I'm gonna punt on middleware for this lecture. And then the execution of some callbacks. So as we've seen in the past examples, right, we had get, the route we want to do, and then the callback, if you will. This is the general form, so you have a simple routes example here where we have a get. You can do a post, right? We've talked about get and post so far. We have foo, here we have pink, and we have our callback function and what we want to do. All right. And then you can bind to both or really all HTTP methods coming in. And you can even specify patterns, which we'll talk about in a minute, on the URL. So I can bind to more generic forms of that URL and send back based on any date. All right, so that is the simple routes version, which is also on your code over here. And that's going to bind to 8081. So let's run simple routes. And if we go back to our browser, oops, lost the browser, hang on. There we go, and we go to 8081. All right, and what do we have? We have foo. All right, comes back with bar. We had user with anything we wanted, any verb for users. We could do, we could introduce that error part again. Oh, we got a 404, right? We didn't bind to any of those paths. And then the last one was a post, right? So what do? I put in something like post? No, it was supposed to be pink. But I didn't, it can't get pink, right? It's telling me that I can't do that verb. The problem wasn't the URL in this case, it's a verb. I need to be able to post, not to get on here. So I didn't have any particular way of doing that. All right. Now if I go into my tool to actually construct a post, which is why you need a tool like this, again, Postman or ARC or REST Easy like this one, I can specify a post method here. And if I put in our URL and I send that, then 200, I got back OK, which means it likes what I sent it. And when I looked, I got the elephant back, right? Why? Because using this tool, I'm able to send a post message, an HTTP post, to my Node server and get those results. All right. I need to bring back all my things back on the screen. Okay. So that's an example, a simple example of routing. Some more in them. When you route, you can use parameters also. You have access to convenience APIs for grabbing parameters, either from query strings or from post payload, so it'll help you parse the payload. Also, you can use regular expressions or define parameters, right? Defined parameters provide what's called a simple interceptor pattern approach. Each defined parameter found may invoke a callback that is executed before the route handler. This is kind of like something called a servlet filter. We'll see more of that kind of thing when we do the middleware part. We also have the ability to use regular expressions or simple syntactic expressions. So you see, for example, the use of a colon syntax. That allows me to get very easy access to an ID parameter on the user. Actually, this is misspelled, should be user. This next must be invoked to keep what's called a chain of responsibility pattern going. This part is going to be foreshadowing. I'm foreshadowing the use of what's called middleware. All right, so that's why I'm kind of talking about it real quick here, because that's going to be the topic of our next discussion. But just to generalize it, and you can realize that you can do these things inside of Express, and then we'll talk about middleware next time. So that's the second part. All right, so again, let me pause for a second. What have we dealt with so far? We've dealt with the routing logic, the delegation part. The steps 1 and 2, the response header and parameter handling. We're going to have a little bit of convenience things around parameters is all I'm trying to say there. But otherwise, it's really the same as the whole HTTP model. Just we have some convenience methods. That's really all that's different. Is a little easier to use API. But the routing part is entirely different, right? In HTTP, for us to route, we have to do all that processing ourselves. We've got to go look at the query string, or the URL and the query string, look at the headers and so forth to decide what function to invoke. So we have to do that delegation, if you will, ourselves. The concept of routing allows us to bind specifically to where we want the request to go, what callback we want to have executed. That's step 3 of our 6-step pattern. We also saw on the response side that we also have some convenience method, the notion of a send, some convention over configuration, kinds of things to do step 5 of the template pattern, and so forth. But still, even in our previous examples, like this one, right, the issue that we have here is even in the callback, I'm still writing out raw HTML. What I haven't abstracted away is the different concern called presentation. This is presentation logic, right? It says how I want it to show up on the screen, and I know what's going to show up as HTML, so I'm writing HTML directly inside my Node application. All right, and if I want to abstract that part away and keep my presentation part dynamic, manipulable, decoupled, then I need to get this kind of stuff out of my main routing logic, right? This is my controller. This is my step 3, but yet I'm assembling the payload, my step 4. I'm doing this together, right? This stuff is tightly coupled. It's happening inside the callback, bound to that. How can I abstract that away? From a presentation standpoint, there's been, again, I've mentioned some historical technologies approach to this. XML, XSL, JSP, ASP and .NET platform and so forth. But templating is kind of the basic approach that's been used really since as a kind of a first generation implementation of web rendering technologies. I mean, going back to when I talked about Java in the 2000 period, the 2001 period, and I said view technologies are a lot, basically equate to the presentation layer. At that time, in addition to frameworks like Struts and so forth coming about, there were additional view technologies that came about. I mentioned a couple in passing last time. Velocity was one, Free Marker was another. All kind, and there's tons of these as well. Templating technologies basically are the simplest thing to do. They basically kind of create a cookie cutter approach to what gets rendered on a page, meaning you kind of view your page in this structured kind of way that I drew down here and say, okay, basically this is a template. Each one of these widgets is a template for me to fill out and populate. All right. So I basically create a structure that represents each one of those boxes, and then I tell my web application that I need to fill those things in, basically. So that's what I mean by templating technology in this regard. Okay. Even though they've been around for a long time, Node can do templates too. In fact, there's lots of them out there. Again, you can npm install any number of these. However, there are two variations of these that are quite popular. One's called Jade, one's called EJS. EJS is a little bit simpler in terms of its kind of syntax and so forth. But Jade's a little more popular. You have a few more features to it. I don't care. I mean, the goal of this class is not to become an expert in either one of these technologies. I'll make you use them. But I want to make sure you're aware of view templating technology in any technology platform. All right, so I mentioned Java template engines. They would be fronted by a servlet, which means basically way back in this pattern, I got to go all the way back to this. This here would be, this forwarding would be from one servlet to another, and then the view would decide and figure out its rendering by doing it as a servlet. Which means you had to forward from, basically it was an agreement between components, right? Servlets are the components in our component container model. And so you basically have one component forwarding to another component as a part of handing off that responsibility. What happens in Node? Well, Node's got to do a similar thing, but it makes the app engine, this meaning the app object that we're bound to from the Express constructor, responsible for the rendering. So there's this sub part of the app that's called the engine. That engine you set up in different ways. All right, you set the engine, you set the renderer, if you will, and then when you're done with that, you no longer use send in our response. Right, we were doing response.send. When we're using a templating technology, instead we will ask the template to render. All right, based on some references to a file and callback that you want to do. All right. So an example of that would be our template example. All right, let me get rid of my squiggles again. And this simple example, it doesn't really render all that much that's interesting. It actually uses Jade and EJS side by side. Again, these are Jade and EJS are external NPM installable modules, so you've got to get those. Although actually I kind of think that they come as part of, maybe they don't. I have to check to see if they come as part of Express. You create Express. You set, now we're doing an app.set, which means we're setting the configuration, if you will. So I'm setting a view directory that says where things are. we're doing a set of what the view engine is, and we'll start off by using Jade. All right. App engine Jade underscore express helps us get initialized. We're configuring things that are done by HTML to use EJS's render files. So these are each the way that you config each one of these platforms that would show up in each one of your stuff, if you will. There's our listen call. We're setting up some very simple properties on a locals object. The locals object is what's going to marshal things into the view so the view knows what's to render. And then I'm going to call app.get on the Jade template, and I'm going to call my render, all right, on the response on using the Jade template, versus in EJS I'm going to do an app.render using that particular HTML, and I'll show you what these templates look like. And I'll still call the send here, but notice I'm doing an app.render and I'm doing the send inside it. If you actually look, actually I can do it right here within brackets. If I look at the views, here's what the EJS, and again, let me clean up real quick from the previous one. So if you look at the EJS template, right, this is HTML, right? You see all the HTML tags around it, except for we have the same kind of concept we had with server-side scripting, server-side includes, where we are embedding special syntax that the template engine will go and look for, so it can do the, again, this is the stuff, these are the properties set with the app locals in the code. It will go look through and bind those symbols, and that's what the app engine does for you by looking for that particular syntax. That's what the %equals does. If I looked at, so again, EJS is considered simpler because it's a very simple substitution here, right? You could have done this, I mean, in fact, if you looked at our solution in Lab 2, you would see we had our own little funky syntax and a substitution going on for different content in there based on that substitution. Well, this app engine is just doing the same exact thing, right? But if I went and looked at what a Jade template might look like, so let's look at this one, all right? Well, this doesn't look like HTML, right? Instead, this is doing more of a structural thing, right? So this shows me I have a doc type of HTML. Considering the English variant of HTML, there's my head part, there's my body part, no close things, my title, and my block content that I'm going to bind to. Now, Jade has far more defaults to understand what these things are. In fact, if I look at the other Jade template that's in here, this is the one that shows me how I'm binding to, all right, I'm binding to those app.local properties again that we saw, all right. On top of that, I'm outputting, I can still output some specific content, but you notice I'm not writing the H1 tag, I'm indicating tags, and then, oh, this is like a markdown format, right, to that. And not only that, though, an additional feature that I kind of have here now is I'm indicating what template I'm extending. So now I'm composing templates together, and I'm binding my block content that we saw back on this one, right? The body's block content here, this is the main Jade, and now I go here to the user Jade, and I say I extend the main Jade, and here's what block content is for this one. Now I can create other ones that extend main Jade as well, and then when I go to them, I can indicate what the block content is, and maybe the block content is different. So again, an extra feature that allows me to take the structure of the main page that I had here with its title, and if this is the block content part of a larger page, it means I can bind different sub-templates to it. And that's kind of Jade's, an example of Jade's extra functionality. Again, for our purposes in this class, knowing the full power and intricacies of the templating technologies, although we'll be on a lab for you, it's not really the purpose of the class to be too upset. I mean, normally the view layer technologies, because now, these kinds of things are the kinds of things that you would typically have your user interface people worry about creating and structuring. You, as the application developer, you would be far more interested in what goes in here and how you defined it, how you got that stuff. I mean, this is a very simple example where it's just binding these properties, hardwiring them. But this stuff kind of created a little data API, right? This is the stuff that's going to show up over in the templating technology for it to render. So it's got to make sense together, right? It's got to match, right? You can't have symbols here that over in the templating technology don't exist, or vice versa. So this is where you kind of have a meeting between you and the UI developer to make sure the information you're passing back and forth matches in this kind of internal API type approach. But really, your user interface designer may decide to totally relay out the page a different way or for a different type of user. Use an application programmer, don't care. Your job is to dynamically compute this kind of stuff, all right? Which again, this kind of stuff, so that the template renderer could use it. So that's what this is about. That's the Node version of this. Is this kind of information I'm saying right here that gets passed back. You as the application developer, you do web application developer does this part. You're going to be involved in this part of this class, but sometimes you'll have services-oriented people doing that. And then you set up what the internal API is so that the view-oriented people, which are typically, again, your user interface people, are going to worry then about getting this part. So this part in Node is what you just saw in the example as the app locals part. Okay? I don't think I can make that diagram any messier in this case. Okay. Okay, so that's templates. Express does provide some convenience. I've already kind of mentioned this, so I'm going to go through this real quick. It has some convenience around the HTTP request object and the HTTP response. So there's some additional things you can do with the request and response. It's again, just convenient. Convenience means it's a shortcut. It's going to make your code a little bit more concise. It's going to do some convention over configuration. We already talked about response.send. There's actually a built-in conversion to send JSON back automatically, and even something called JSONP, which I don't know if we'll get to in this class, maybe at the end, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. You can look, there is an express send JSON. In fact, real quick, the express send JSON example. In fact, this one does JSON and JSONP. It's going to send a JSON version of this object. Realize this, from here to here, this is an object literal, right? This isn't JSON itself. This is an object literal. And what does response.json do in ExpressFine? Well, it's a convenience thing, right? You could convert this object to JSON yourself. You could stringify it, right? And you could do the response.write, the little HTTP module, or in one fell swoop, you can do the whole thing inside of Express without any issue, right? All in one invocation, right? So if we ran Express send JSON, all right, and we go to 8081/JSON. I guess I'll just go back to this one. All right, I get back to the JSON object. Again, nothing earth-shattering here, nothing that you couldn't already do, simply a convenience mechanism. Likewise, if you remember from your lab, you had to write out both text and binary files from your news, and now you have the ability to send files directly, or even send objects that are downloadable. So I encourage you to look at these things again as a convenience type mechanism in these examples. It's simply like, here's a download one. This one simply makes it that much easier for somebody to send non-text types, right? Here we're sending a Word file down, and here we're sending an image file down to the client. And when you look at that, notice things that you had to do in the low-level HTTP API are not here. We didn't MIME type it. We didn't do the content length and so forth. Now you can set some things, right? You can set these things. This is an options parameter. So again, you have the power to drill down when you do convention over configuration, as it's called, meaning you take intelligent defaults that a framework's willing to give you. But you can always drill down and change those so they make sense for you. All right, this max age is a caching directive, if you will. The root tells you where in a file system it is. But I got all kinds of things I could put in the options to change the convention defaults in case I wanted to do something specific. But otherwise, Express is going to guess for me. It's going to MIME type this to the proper MIME type, right, in image.jpg. It's going to take and send file in this one for the download URL. It's going to MIME type that as whatever the application octet string or whatever else it is, it's supposed to be, and you'll get that downloaded. So these kind of things are done by default for you with the ability to change them. And again, all in the name of convenience, meaning to make your code more compact and readable without having to go through all the minutiae of manipulation that you do in a low-level API. Okay, to summarize, what parts of MVC did we talk about with respect to Node and Express? Well, the first thing is we dealt with the incoming request, right? This, again, I go back, let me make, again, we got 6 things here, right? We've got the MVC pattern, and we've got the template pattern for the render pipeline. This summary, these 6 that I'm talking about here, that we're talking about the MVC pattern, okay? So the first thing we dealt with, incoming request, great, we dealt with that, right? This is our app.verb type of thing with the route URL, blah, 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 okay? We delegate into the business layer. So we delegate because we have this route, and then we put a callback here, right? We are delegating. We're delegating in an asynchronous fashion. What about the world model state that we talk about, right? Going into the world model state and the entire model, which means our world model state plus our business logic, if you will. Well, you use whatever persistent story you want. So sitting back, once you access, we've been using the FSMID module for the old file system because we're not going back. But you could use a database, you could use a NewSQL database like MongoDB. You can use whatever you want back there for the world model state. Nothing about the MVC structure we've talked about so far tells you what database to use or how to organize your business logic. All right, all kinds of things are done here. We talked about in 422, for example, if you want a business rules engine here or whatnot. Again, these things exist, but this is the one part. This is the strategy part of that pattern, where we interface into what is independent about our web application in our service-oriented approach to computing for our organization. We go back into factoring presentation into a rendering layer. In this case, we talked about templates, all right? Servlets tended to pass control. I talked about that concept of forwarding. Again, you didn't do that in here. I wouldn't worry about it. But here, rendering, meaning the app.engine stuff, followed by the render stuff, whichever app.render or response.render. This is just more work that goes on the event queue, all right? It's more asynchronous calls, all right? The views bind the values to whatever symbols. Again, you saw the app.locals. Pretty simple way. Basically, we're filling in the blanks on our template, our view template, and then we send a response back, or we call render, more precisely using the view template terminology, to render the page as a response. All right. So that's how Express does what's really compared to the Java stack, for example. It's actually a very simple, very rudimentary approach to model view controller, but still it's very effective. It's an organizing principle for our code. It separates our concerns, and it's quite extensible, so it's very powerful in that regard. Summary: MVC, no matter NodeExpress, Java framework, Ruby framework, Django, whatever it is that you use, it is the predominant web application design pattern. Even when we go to the client side in the second half of this course, we're going to revisit MVC. We're going to show we're going to tweak it a bit for the client side. But even for client-centric applications, we are still going to maintain this pattern. Just do our variations on it. This is one of these things, again, for this class that I want you to take away, regardless of the technology we use. I don't care what web development framework your organization, your development team decides to go with, or if somebody comes in running in saying, here's, we got a new one. One of the first things you would look for in that web development framework is, where is MVC? All right, where's Waldo? Where's MVC? How does it do MVC? Because most likely, not 100%, nothing is 100% in life, but just about any web application framework I've come along, the first thing they talk about is, here's how we do MVC. Here's how we separate these concerns. Here's how that magic happens. Here's our philosophy, our approach to implementing that. And so it gives you that frame of reference to understand any web platform technology that you're going to deal with. All right, so that's WebMVC with Express. Next we will talk about middleware in Express, meaning decorating, if you will. Decorating meaning injecting or the interceptor pattern I talked about before, adding more features and functionality like supporting conversational state that we talked about with the server state lecture into our applications while maintaining that consistency with the MVC pattern.